Welcome back to the About Manchester podcast. Today we speak to Anastasia Taylor-Lind, an internationally renowned photojournalist, about her time in Ukraine and the exhibition Ukraine Photographs from the Frontline, showing at the Imperial War Museum North.
You went out to Ukraine in 2014.
Yeah.
When if my history's correct, when the first protests against what was then a Russian-backed government began.
So the Euromaidan protests began as protests against Viktor Yanukovych, the then Ukrainian president, who had rejected trade deals with the European Union in favor of trade deals with Russia. So it was this shift. And so students initially came out in protest because they wanted to see Ukraine moving more towards Europe than towards Russia. And those protests eventually ousted him in February 2014.
Can I just ask what drew you out there personally?
It was the reason I went to Ukraine initially was unrelated to any of these photographs. I was working on a completely different project that I had planned to photograph in Donetsk city, which is now in the occupied territories, but it sits in the east of the country in Donbass. And I was on my way there when I passed through Kyiv to get press accreditation from the Ministry of Health. And that took a few days. So in those few days, I started visiting Maidan, the central square in Kyiv, and I began photographing the protests by setting up a makeshift portrait studio inside the barricades. And when my press accreditation eventually came through, I decided to stay, and I stayed in Maidan until the revolution was won.
Okay.
A few weeks later, Russia invaded, occupied, and annexed Crimea, and then supported a violent separatist movement in the east of the country that left two regions, two unrecognized republics, declaring independence. And so I moved then to the east to start photographing there. And the original project that I came to do never happened.
Right, okay.
But it's like that sometimes.
When we did a piece on Ukraine when the latest war broke out, and I remember speaking to somebody saying that has the Third World War started, and she told me that the Third World War started in 2014. Is that right?
Well, the war in Ukraine started in 2014, yes. Okay. And a front line that was established in the east of the country divided families and communities and was fought over for the last 8 years. So it was a war that became known as the Forgotten War, or was described as a frozen conflict. That was until the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine in February this year. So, it's true to say that the war in Ukraine has been going on since 2014.
Okay. And were you in Ukraine when the latest war broke out?
I was not. I was in London.
Okay.
Frankly, I didn't believe it could happen.
Okay.
Wishful thinking. And following the US intelligence briefings, eventually I booked a flight to Kyiv for the end of February, a flight that was of course cancelled because the invasion happened. And so I left the next day, flew to Poland, and started by reporting on the refugee crisis at the border, and then moved into Ukraine. Okay. I couldn't believe that it would happen.
Okay. Some of the photographs, the most powerful photographs I found were obviously of what's going on at the moment, and that the one of the woman looking at where all the bodies had been
Bucha, yeah.
In Bucha, was it Bucha? Yeah.
Yeah, you've probably heard that name. It's a small suburb of. It's a suburb of Kyiv that's become infamous and synonymous with Russian war crimes.
Okay. So you obviously went there. What else did you find?
I was on assignment for the Guardian newspaper.
Okay.
In early April, and those northwestern suburbs of Kyiv had just been retaken by the Ukrainian army.
Okay.
And what war crimes investigators found there at this church in Bucha was a mass grave, which the authorities then excavated in order to identify the people who were buried there and to give them proper burials. So the grave had been dug by mortuary staff. While the Russians occupied the town, the morgue had become overwhelmed, and citizens appealed to the Russian soldiers to allow them to dig a trench using a digger in a churchyard, not in a graveyard, but in the grounds of a church, to then bury many people at once. We met one mother who was looking for her son, and when he had been taken and his body left outside the morgue during the Russian occupation, they had written his name and his address on a small piece of paper and tucked it inside his sock so that they'd be able to find his body afterwards.
Okay.
Yeah, it was. It's always in the details, huh?
Yeah,
it's in the details that are most painful for me too.
Yeah. No, absolutely. You've obviously been out there. You've obviously spoken to a lot of people. You've probably made a lot of friends out there. What's the feeling now in the country about what's going to happen? Do they think they're going to take the territory back? Do they think there's going to be some ceasefire? Are they scared of escalating into a possible nuclear conflict? These
are all the questions that the international community are asking, and journalists are asking, right? Yeah. It's not really my job to speculate as a journalist. I don't believe.
No.
I didn't believe that this level of violence and destruction could be meted out so quickly against Ukraine by the Russians. So my ability to imagine what might happen is probably not that accurate.
You obviously have a very strong affinity with the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian nation now.
I've worked there for such a long time, and as you say, I have so many dear and close friends there now. So that connection comes through close friendships. But to answer your question, we've seen a very successful Ukrainian counteroffensive in the north, in Kharkiv region in the last month. I was in Kharkiv when this offensive began.
Okay.
Although I didn't know about that.
Right.
Although I didn't know about that.
They didn't take you off.
No, they did not. And I think it's several thousand square kilometers of territory has been retaken by the Ukrainians. So this is a fact.
Okay.
And also, just to mention briefly, the Ukrainian, we don't know who did it, but the Kerch bridge being blown up last week.
Yeah.
And then these really deadly attacks against civilians, Monday morning rush hour, central Kyiv. So,
and infrastructure as well, wasn't it?
Yes, you're right.
Yeah.
Electricity outages across the country.
Yeah.
So militarily, it looks positive for the Ukrainians right now. At the same time, most of my friends are pretty depressed, because beyond the immediate, not because, and beyond the immediate impacts of living in a war zone, so seeking shelter, making sure your relatives are safe, hoping that your brother who's fighting on the front line isn't killed, all of those very immediate things, evacuating family members, taking shelter. The effects of war also mean that it's impossible to make any long-term plans. You can't, think of all the things we plan in our lives beyond one day. So starting university, sending the kids back to school. More than 3,000 schools and kindergartens have been destroyed. So there aren't even schools to send the kids to in a lot of areas. Getting married, like thinking about career progression or changing jobs or even having a job, or opening your small business, which has been closed. All those ordinary things. So a life without plans for the future, I'm learning from my friends, is really hard as well. It's like there's two levels of challenge there.
And are you planning to go back there soon?
Yes, of course.
Can you tell me when?
I hope before the end of the month.
Okay.
So I've spent most of my time since the Russian invasion in February in Ukraine, and I'm here now because this exhibition is opening, and I have some other work commitments in the UK, but I'll be going back. Typically, what I'm aiming to do is spend about a month in Ukraine, a month at home, sort of time it like that. When the invasion started, I was there for 2 months. Came home for a little bit, then I went for 6 weeks. Came home for a little bit, so I want to be able to report on what some of the things that are happening in the country. I don't know for how long. I've been working there for 8 years. I don't imagine I would stop anytime soon.
And just on the exhibition side, are you hoping to take it somewhere else?
This show is open until January, until the new year, and then it will tour to Imperial War Museum in London. And it'll be there from the 7th of February until the 7th of May. Yeah.
Well, I wish you all the luck, Anastasia. Thank you so much for talking, and maybe when you come back from Ukraine again, we can talk again. Would that be nice?
Of course we can.